Good afternoon, friends. Let's go on a great type of campaign together with Batu Khan and the 14th Tsareviches, from the house of Genghis Vo, and so they went in the spring of 1236. A huge army marched from Mongolia to conquer western countries. 12 to 14 Tsareviches from the house of Genghis Vo participated in the campaign. First of all, these are the children of Joki Khan, his eldest son Orju, and what is he? The heir of Batu Shiban Thangud and the brother of Batu Khan Daki, the future Muslim. The future Khan of the Golden Horde too. Is probably wrong to call Batu Khan in principle because Harman was never Khan in the 13th century. There could be only one great Khan in Karakoram. But the Russian chronicles are absolutely right. The title of Wali Batu prevailed. Because its Chinese title Zhong, just meant to have King Wang is a Chinese king, is a title below Imperial Hogong Khan of the Mongols thought of the emperor. And so you give them translated Plano Carpini such that for all your European style of the emperor, of the Holy Roman Empire and then of the Mongolian Great, but Soto. The emperor besides the sons of Joki participated in the campaign sons run south. And Kaden grandson of Chagatai Storms, sons Tolui, Minggu and Buchik Idar, and finally, the son of Genghis Khan's youngest son from his beloved wife of the Gul Saxo account 13 prince. But other historians account for 12 to 14. Why? Because their number has varied. For example, Kublai Sintal. I participated in the final stage of the Western campaign from Kiev and on in Europe. It was common practice in the Mongol Empire. When Yongzheng the young prince was sent for training in the military campaign, under the supervision of experienced military leader. Batu participated in Chinese the campaign Subutai in 1230 to 34th year. He studied military affairs this way, and Kublai, future ruler of China, participated in the campaign in Europe at the same time, thus expanding the horizons. Princes of the house of Genghis. Here are 14 of the princes. And the Armenian chronicler Makok Munkai wrote briefly about what each had one domain army. And historians ever since is repeated Toman troops, Tomia 2 armies, turns out 140,000 people. But the voice at the time of the death of Genghis Khan in the whole Mongol army was 129,000 warriors, and both of them 140,000 could go somewhere, but I'll leave it on the conscience, uncritically appropriate to the number of Mongol troops from only, and among they have even serious people, but such as novels Epichesky. Meanwhile, as a simple comparison of the list of participating in the campaign with princes' number of tents given to the sons of Genghis Khan and their parents, that is under section empire, which produced even Genghis, shows that there could be a maximum of 30 to 40,000 Mongol wars. Because their essence, she was up to 4,000 GD or caravans, 5,000 Chagatai 8, or vice versa. Text. Not only remember Tolui received 101,000 wagons, but he was hotbeds as the guardian of half. And that was to ensure the transfer of power after Genghis Khan appointed heir of that have guides. And what he did, but 101,000 tents, he survived responsible Minka's son, Taloi the future great Khan. He could certainly spend a lot of wards, but most likely not brought because it was not necessary. Because if China 50 strong army, as I roughly estimate the order of the numbers as follows. The number of Mongol soldiers who went on the Western campaign 50,000. The war in China was so-so. The Chinese fielded significantly larger troops, albeit of poor quality. But the fact is that Genghis Khan himself practically never commanded a large number of soldiers in one battle. Very rarely, of course. He led more than 100. China also had thousands of men against Khwarezm Shah Muhammad. But they always acted in separate corps, primarily for logistical reasons. Because each Mongol led 3 horses with him. One he rode on, the other he carried baggage, and the third was a war horse, and had to be protected as the apple of his eye because he saved his master's life in battle. But also themselves, you see. 3 horses in general are not even enough. because the campaign was going to be a long 7,000 kilometers from Mongolia to the Volga. If something happens to the horses, it will be very difficult for the directorate, so historians, following the sources, write that every Mongolian warrior made 3 or 4 horses with himself. But to imagine himself 50,000 warriors each has 3 or 4 horses is almost 200. 0 horses is a huge crowd, music and 200,000 horses in the steppes of Kazakhstan or behind the waves could really drink small rivers. Because if 200,000 horses were brought to some kind of geyser today, then they really drank just because a horse requires a lot of water and this force moved west. And to imagine the scale of just the transfer of troops from, I will say, that for the next time in history, the logical transfer was carried out only by the Russian Empire during the Russo-Japanese War, and at the same time it used the railway. The Mongols did not have a railway and their way Turkestan or behind the waves could really drink small rivers because if 200,000 horses were brought to some kind of geyser today, then they really drank just because a horse requires a lot of water and this force moved west. And to imagine the scale of just the transfer of troops from, I will say, that for the next time in history, the logical transfer was carried out only by the Russian Empire during the Russo-Japanese War, and at the same time it used the railway. The Mongols did not have a railway and their way to the Kazakh Khaganate and gradually dissolving in the North Caucasus among all the nations, giving rise to Kabardians and Balkars, Circassians and other members of other nations. The North Caucasus has entered these ancient Bulgarians. Other part ran north to Koma, and there founded the Kal Bulgaria. Volga Bulgaria and the third party led by Kon Asparuhaya moved west of the Danube, and there mingled with the Slavs created Great Bulgarian Empire at first. It was Great Bulgarian Khanate, which usual fierce was the Byzantine Empire. Concrum, after defeating the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus, one cut off his head and made his skull gilt bowl of who drank mare's milk were nomads of the steppe peoples, but gradually Danubian Bulgaria and disappeared into the Slavic Sea, passing the Slavs his the name, but not their language. And in the early 11th century is Bulgarian, the kingdom was sacked of the Byzantine Empire and ceased to exist. Bulgaria still exists, but those who ran to the Koma formed here trading Ava trading place other power, but it was very similar to Russia, which arose soon a little to the west of Naoki, and the upper Volga approximately the same level of agriculture was accordingly. The rapid rise of the population of a large urban population / and burn agriculture is to feed, all respectively the peak of crafts, and of course, it was a country which was on a large in the Volga trade route. Trade of that country in the first place here was the expedition to the feast for furs, and on this road the northern Ural got Sasanian silver before Koma Bulgaria was very rich land. Hence the caravan with slaves was in the Urgench Kharezm. Yes, down plains with goods in the lower reaches of the Volga River, or as it was called Turk and still it is called Itil or Edel Adil. But the meaning is the same on these, and the Raven and the Caucasus is the Volga trade route, was always much more important trade artery than the path from the Varangians to the Greeks. Here they are organized his state. It was developed country with a tradition of craft gorgeous skin maketh the Bulgars private metallurgy, is information about how what the Koma Bulgarians first in Europe learned to smelt iron in the 13th century. The house of voice that was 200 years earlier than the caste learned to smelt Western Europe well. Of course the Russians and the Poles at this time also know iron, didn't know it was called Omsk Bulgaria. Thousands of cities is certainly a poetic exaggeration of the same like. When you say 1,000 islands or country of thousands of lakes, there actually was a lot. But here is a map of the archaeological explorations that produced in the Russian Empire are marked 120 settlements, about which was discovered Bulgar settlement. In the list of Bulgarian towns we find somewhere around 60 cities, towns and so on, fortified settlements here, but you imagine that nearby is a huge Rus, where in the 13th century historians have more than 300 cities, small Volga Bulgaria here. The order of 120 was really urban country in all likelihood. Today, it has already become clear from the archaeological site of these cards, where Bulgaria is called a small spot at the confluence of Kama and Volga. Videos some are not accurate. In fact, the boundary of the spheres, the influence of Volga Bulgaria was significantly greater, because the opening Penza archaeologists Rivasora Zolotarevka and settlement show that it was the southwestern frontier of the Volga. Bulgaria was a Bulgarian fortress, is Penza, and on the other hand we know that the Bulgarians initiated a campaign to Ustjug site between Penza and Siris, respectively. Between the Urals and Ok, it was the influence of the Volga. Bulgaria was a big country with a developed urban population craft, and she converted to Islam even before Rus converted to Orthodoxy, which is in general. And the truth is, as every other major trading routes in the Volga, Bulgaria was introduced in Muslim countries. But and then you realize in those days, because faith is taken as a marker of national identity, then was not a nation in the modern sense of the word, but faith played a role of this, the characteristic which distinguishes friend from foe, that all national differences, it was said, some of the concept was not invented ethnographers, and so is always prone to natural ancient, before human monkeys are such a fun friend and foe, a stranger here in the Middle Ages, in the early primary grade. Emma contrast another table, religion, and because the Khazars were Jews, Russian Orthodox Church adopted, where could the poor Bulgarians go? They naturally converted to Islam and thereby isolated themselves from these competitors. Because it was on the trade route, of course. For him the main task was trade. From here they faced Russia, which controlled Novgorod and the Volga-Oka interfluve of the upper reaches of the Great Volga trade route, and the Khazar Khaganate, which controlled the lower reaches of the Volga. Competitors huddled, everyone took their daimyo to break the way, and the same task was why Volga Bulgaria flourished in the 13th century, because in 1200 for the Crusaders defeated Constantinople, and trade that went through Byzantium with the Middle East was finally disrupted. They lived on the lower Volga as descendants of the Khazars, and for 15 years fierce battles were fought with the Mongol army on the banks of the Yaik River, that is, the Urals. And then, after the defeat inflicted on him by Subutai Bogota in 1229, they built a Zasuknaya line on the eastern borders of their kingdom, where they stopped in 1230 to a large offensive of the Mongol troops, commanded by the name of Subutai. As I said, it wasn't exactly how it could be understood from my words. In fact, it's just that in this case, I didn't even talk myself out of the screen. The legend there is just how I write. Subutai fought in the west. Nothing is reported that he was in China, and he was just in 1230 in 1945, in China. He commanded one of the corps of the Mongolian army during the destruction of the empire. Subutai led the Mongolian troops in 1232. His offensive was stopped by the Bulgars at the Zasuknaya line, before reaching the great Bulgarian city, as the Russian chroniclers wrote. This in itself was an outstanding achievement that no one else in Eastern Europe managed to achieve this. But for some reason, they don't write about it in our school textbooks or in books about the invasion of the Mongols. Where you miss it is clearly stated, so that's a little bit, and then it went even more interesting. The Tsar, realizing that a terrible disaster was coming to his country, tried to negotiate an alliance with Grand Duke Yuri I of Vladimir, but Yuri refused to help the Bulgarians. Peace was concluded before the Bulgarians. The only thing to do was to conclude a peace treaty with the Russians. End the war. First there was a truce, then another one. They excluded the peace treaty and delimited the sphere of influence. But the Russians refused to help the Bulgars. The Toxins were defeated in 1229. Bashkirs sided with Subutai Bogota in 1235, and there were too few of them. In the end, it was difficult to judge the youth. The Kipchaks remained the only allies of the Bulgarians. But they themselves were pressed by the Mongols because one of the detachments of the Mongol army was sent against the Kipchaks, and they barely held the banks of the Volga. And then the Bulgarian Tsar Ilgam gathered everyone who could bear arms. The Bulgarians conducted a total mobilization of their I won't say a man, and gathered a very large army against the Mongols. Giulini and Rashid I described the battle, which gave the Bulgarians the united troops of the Mongol Empire. United in the confines of the Bulgar, all the prince journeyed different columns. In the autumn of 1236 come together in the limits Bulgarian merged together, and this joined the Mongol army. Given a general battle waxes Bulgarians, and the Bulgarians managed to put more men than was the Mongol. This the greatest battle, very little the news, and they are extremely confusing, because all the fault of the Hungarians they time was very actively looking for their historical motherland of the Great Hungary, which was just here. Somewhere here the Urals, on the territory of Bashkiria, and music constantly confused Bashkirs and vendors, while the Bashkirs are completely different people and language group. They have another. But apparently there was something in common in these ancient tribes, and first general of the territory in which they lived. Therefore, that the European travelers, here is the Hungarian friar Julian spy other missionaries, who were sent in search of Great Eastern Hungary. That chroniclers, they constantly confused the Magyars and Magyars, Bashkirs the Bashkirs. Somewhere nearby they are not all the time. And everything that happened with the Bashkirs with the Magyars, they have all merged into one pile. Because Jovit, who left the message, detailed campaign in the west that Rashid al-Din. They were not his contemporaries, eyewitnesses to the events, reported information from the second third hand. Rashid I do it just told him to take such news to gather in one folder. All this stitch and present Iranian con as history as it is. Naturally, I have not read, but he gave it to his vizier. He was the vizier. He had a lot, but imagine the Minister of Finance, Prime Minister modern Medvedev for example, the button to write the story, but I don't think he just time if he could give the team here. Rashid Single gave the command. He gathered his record, but he had not checked it, is not being the historian, did not know what it is. You fold a slack here as well like this, all twisting them, and well on the desk clerks was terrified because there were rather collection of materials was there all stuck God knows where, not processed completely. But for historians, this is the value. So Rashid al-Din's confused description. The battle between the Mongols and the Bulgars, with the battle on the river neck because it's great Hungarians, and there as if Hungary was a great battle, and then a great battle. And his description of the battle are the description of the Battle of the Volga, Bulgaria. First, chronologically worthwhile in the character descriptions, as not so merged one battle. There were two of them different, and this great battle. The Mongols defeated the Bulgarian army, rumble and defeated, but now I find myself. This description I get it quotes, so here is the link of Rashid al-Din reports that the Bulgars, upon learning of the approach of the Mongols, gathered about 400,000 soldiers. 40 folk again naturally figure fantastic sense only to show that the Bulgars were much greater than the combined forces of the Mongols. The Mongols on the spot when they Bulgars had heard rumors about the movement of the bat. And the Amir writes Rashid al-Din was prepared from 40 misty troops in motion. Washer, brother of Batu Khan II, valued residents settled here in Bulgaria. He turned hard, and a lot burnt cities remain on the path of his army where he commanded the others. Not everywhere can participate. Batu Khan tried to spare his future subjects. Burundi, who made the conquest of Volga, Bulgaria, too, was distinguished by a special passion for crowwood wool. Therefore, The population, a significant portion survived, moreover survived. Even the top part of the because Rashid I reports came to ruler Bulgarian accordion. And Jack have expressed resignation and was appointed to govern his people, subordinate to the Mongols. But then they organized the rebellion, devastated hairy Mongols, moved on, believed that the fate of Bulgaria and ended, but excavations are conducted and Belafish on the altar Oskam Gorodishi under Penza showed that it didn't end at the walls of the Bulgarian capital. Dilara ended much later, when the Mongolian troops came to the extreme south, the western boundary of the Bulgarian kingdom, and attacked the fortress. Here is the Zolotarevsky and settlement. Here's a look at satellite map of Volga in a mug, then designated it the most settlement in the forest between two converging ravines. So here we are with a triangular, the only gates in the design of this settlement close to scale, very well seen. And modern settlements, Zolotarevka is a working village when it was a village now. There are 2,500 residents, live well by our standards. This is a large, but like this here village in fact. But to compare about the modern past here in this little slices, like this here castle. This ancient settlement, archaeologists estimated 2,500 of people died in the defense of the settlement. So happened that this is the only untouched space battle period of the Mongol invasion. The Mongols, that the strength of which the benefit is quite interesting. But still it was the wooden earthen strengthened despite the pitfalls on all sorts of mark. But what could they do against common governmental machines imported from China? They of course think that it is interesting that music defended the fortress. Representatives Yenisei culture with pussy characteristic, the ancestors of modern Kyrgyz and Akkadians, Sky Kyrgyz mowers, that their soldiers lived in this golden sharp the mound and fought against the Mongol troops and died here. Most likely battle, it was already late autumn. The most likely explanation for why the settlement was untouched, the coast of key warriors, with traces of wounds and injuries caused by cold arms, a huge number of fragments of swords. Arabic name of the settlement was found, more saber fragments than in the entire territory of Russia, and the rest of the Mongol huge amount arrowheads, remains of the wolf pits. Okay, the horse with a rider that there died in this wolf's hole. There's a lot of interesting stuff. Why all of this is preserved? Because usually, since iron was extremely expensive those days, and the armor was generally the object of great value, full heavy armor rider costs so much. How many modern Mercedes, they were carefully gathered after the battle. Therefore, on the battlefields of ancient, you like the rule will not find almost anything here. Everything is left for two reasons. The first reason is that there is then no longer lived, and all that remained to stand down is covered with forests and pristine. Reached our days in the first, and the second, what else is important to apparently because the battle was at the end of the year, already late autumn, probably just when snow battle filled the whole thing, and then if that's still frozen and icy, and in general could once had been looking for hard to find, they gave it up and went untouched. And accordingly the field of battle remained to our days. And here is the archaeologist of the Penza Golovkin, Dr. Historical Sciences. He dig until now. There's a festival at this Zolotarev, the Russian settlement's absolutely amazing place. One amazing monument, because this fortress, in addition to representatives of Elisha, there still was Russian. There was of course the Bulgars' main. There is a core of residents around this fortified place. Was there a few more villages found last year, and sophisticated enough this system here is such a hotbed. Name is agricultural land, which is stood a fortress and trade of. The fact that this fortress was located on a trade route between Kiev and Great Bulgar in Hapu, as there was on the watershed of the note, is not the river and the watershed, that was the way. Land is rare. She was completely different, shows us the relationship of the peoples of the Great Steppe. Desti Kipchak. How are we not exactly how I imagined another 20 to 30 ago? Everything was different, and the border of Volga, Bulgaria more and more interesting composition of the population, and the relationship of different tribes' religions. Other quietly to protect this fortress Bertasi local the population of the tribes, which was depending on the Volga Bulgaria sketches these Caucasia and Kyrgyzstan current rather ancient Russian. Altogether somehow protected from the Mongols. Absolutely amazing page of the history of the struggle in Eastern Europe against invaders, and there died last is of Volga Bulgaria. After that the country was finally defeated, but he conquered.